The fifth plenary meeting of the 10th Emergency Special Session of the General Assembly is called to order. The General Assembly will continue its consideration of Agenda Item 5, entitled Illegal Israeli Actions in Occupied East Jerusalem and the Rest of the Occupied Palestinian Territory. Before giving the floor for explanations of vote after the vote, may I remind delegations that explanations of vote are limited to 10 minutes and should be made by delegations from their seats. I now give the floor to the delegation of Panama.
Gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you, President. After careful consideration and deliberation, Panama decided to support this resolution. This decision was based on our commitment to defend the principles of the Charter of the United Nations, including the right to self-determination for all peoples. However, Panama firmly believes that both peoples, those of Palestine and Israel, deserve to live in peace, with safe, recognized borders. In advocating for the existence of two states with recognized borders, guarantees of security and of peaceful coexistence, Panama seeks to contribute to the stability and prosperity of the region. However, Panama wishes to set forth before this chamber that there are still pending issues to be resolved. The motivation behind the vote in favor of membership of Palestine corresponds to the belief that Palestine also has or should have a tribune where it can express its desires for peace, just as Israel does. But we also wish to express our deep concern regarding the fragility of the elements underpinning its status as a subject of international law within the United Nations system. It is necessary that the Palestinian authorities be a body with true power which has control over this territory and imposes the rule of law and provides guarantees of peace and security for the State of Israel, both from Palestine and from those countries and organizations in conflict with Israel. There is a real need to conclude peace agreements, a need for a recognition of the State of Israel, and for the establishment of diplomatic relations with the State of Israel in order to consolidate a sustainable peace between all protagonists. This decision is motivated by our commitment to foster dialogue, trust, and a peaceful resolution to the long-standing conflict in the Middle East. We believe that this vote reflects our dedication to promoting just and sustainable peace for all parties involved. Ultimately, it is of extreme importance that the Israeli hostages be released, those who have not yet been released, and that an immediate ceasefire is established. We urge the international community to renew its efforts to achieve a just and lasting solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, based on international law and on relevant United Nations resolutions, including the two-state solution, living in peace and security. I thank you, President.
I thank the distinguished delegate of Panama, and I now invite to the floor the distinguished delegate of Portugal.
Mr. President, 77 years ago, this body adopted the landmark Resolution 181, laying down the foundations for the settlement of the Palestinian question. Israel was admitted as a full member of the United Nations 75 years ago, but the same right was not granted to Palestine. Therefore, today we voted in favor, and we welcome the adoption of this General Assembly resolution. We also welcome the enhancement of the rights of Palestine until the Security Council ultimately agrees to recommend its full membership. This resolution is, in our view, in compliance with the UN Charter, and it constitutes a positive step towards a free, democratic, and independent state of Palestine, living side by side with Israel within international recognized borders in peace and security. Portugal remains committed to taking concrete, meaningful steps towards peace and the implementation of a two-state solution. In light of those objectives, we note the most recent bilateral recognitions of the State of Palestine, and we remain engaged in discussions with our partners in this regard. Mr. President, despite the numerous calls against a military ground offensive in Rafah, Israel issued an evacuation order to displace more than 100,000 Palestinians. The rest of the Gaza Strip continues to face bombardments and destruction, and there are more impediments in place for the humanitarian aid to reach those in need. The basic tenets of international humanitarian law are incompatible with such evacuation order, which may amount to forcible transfers. Preventing further loss of life is an urgent priority. Once again, Portugal condemns the horrific terror acts perpetrated by Hamas against Israel on October the 7th. We reaffirm our call for the immediate and unconditional release of the hostages held captive by Hamas and other militant groups in Gaza. And once again, we uphold the need to fully respect international humanitarian law and reiterate that the collective punishment of civilian population is unacceptable. Therefore, we reiterate our call for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza and the immediate use of every humanitarian land crossing and entry points into the Strip at its maximum capacity and for as long as necessary. Furthermore, Portugal fully supports all credible diplomatic efforts for a sustainable peace process. This war must come to an end. The world is calling for it. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Portugal for his statement, and I now offer the floor to the distinguished representative of New Zealand.
President, New Zealand voted yes on the resolution before the General Assembly today. We approach the resolution in a constructive and practical manner. New Zealand considers this resolution a positive step on a pathway towards the eventual two-state solution. We support its intent to make a strong statement on Palestine's aspirations and the international community's expectations for progress on a political solution. We hope it will reinvigorate momentum towards peace and security in the region. At the same time, we voted in favour with the clear intention that our support for the resolution does not imply recognition of Palestinian statehood. The resolution also does not confer full UN membership, which requires a recommendation from the Security Council in accordance with Article 4 of the UN Charter. A Palestinian state is an integral part of New Zealand's long-held position on the fundamental right of the Palestinian people to self-determination and support for a two-state solution. We view this as a when, not if, question. New Zealand also recognises the importance of Palestinian participation in the UN and other international bodies. We supported Resolution 67/19 in 2012. We believe that recognition of Palestinian statehood and admitting it as a full member of the United Nations is inevitable. We do not consider now, in the middle of the current crisis, to be the optimal time to progress the issue of full statehood. Some important issues, such as the political authority of a future Palestinian state, remain unsettled. New Zealand calls on the parties to the conflict in Gaza and all those who exercise influence over the parties to focus attention on the needs of the moment. We must see an immediate ceasefire, the release of hostages, and a significant increase of aid into Gaza to avoid further humanitarian catastrophe and to create a lasting pathway to peace. Thank you very much.
I thank the distinguished representative of New Zealand for his statement, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Hungary.
Mr. President, Hungary is strongly committed to the Charter of the United Nations, and this has informed our vote today on the resolution on the admission of the new members to the United Nations. Our position does not prejudge or jeopardize our long-standing commitment to the two-state solution. Hungary recognizes the right to self-determination of the people of Palestine, and in the spirit of solidarity, Hungary recognized the declaration of the Palestinian state in 1988. Our position here today is guided by the wish to preserve legal clarity and diligent processes within the institution of the UN regarding both the admission process as well as the participation in the UN General Assembly's work. We believe that at present, the current resolution is not conducive to easing the situation and finding a peaceful solution to the conflict in the Middle East. In fact, it may directly contribute to its escalation. We must recall our condemnation of the terrorist attacks committed by the terrorist organization Hamas on 7 October, which have ignited the current war in Gaza and have affected the regional and global stability alike. We also reiterate our call for the immediate and unconditional release of the remaining hostages taken by the terrorist organizations. While debating the present resolution, the aforementioned serious facts cannot be disregarded, as they are contrary to the spirit of the United Nations at the height of the current crisis. As for the procedure of admission of new members, Article 4 of the UN Charter and Rules 136 and 137 of the Rules of Procedure of the General Assembly lay out a clear process. This process starts with the Security Council's recommendation that, by its very nature, must be positive. It is our view that in the absence of such a recommendation necessitated by paragraph 2 of Article 4 of the Charter, the General Assembly is not in a position to make such a determination as enshrined in OP1 of the present resolution. We see this as an ultra-virus action that is not in line with the relevant rules and can set a detrimental precedent for the future. Hungary reiterates its commitment to work with all partners to end the crisis in Gaza without delay and implement United Nations Security Council Resolution 2728, including through reaching an immediate ceasefire and the unconditional release of all hostages, as well as providing full, rapid, safe, and unhindered access to humanitarian aid at scale for Palestinians in need. We are convinced that the only way forward to finding a lasting solution can be based on direct negotiations between the parties, bearing in mind that unilateral actions should be avoided as they could further escalate the situation, especially amidst the current flaring tensions. In this vein, we reiterate our support to a two-state solution that allows the State of Israel to live side by side in peace, security, and mutual recognition with an independent, sovereign, and viable state of Palestine. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished delegation of Hungary, and I now invite the distinguished representative of Canada to take the floor.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, President. In 1947, the United Nations General Assembly adopted Resolution 181, and it convened that the only viable solution for peace in the Middle East was the creation of two states. However, 75 years later, this vision has yet to materialize. The position of Canada on questions relative to Israel and Palestine remains guided, as it always has been, by our historic commitment, our unshakable commitment to a two-state solution. The date of the 7th of October 2023 will go down in history in all of our memories. This day, Hamas killed more than 1,000 people and kidnapped more than 240 people and committed brutal acts of sexual violence. Canada, without hesitation, condemned this attack of Hamas and demanded the release of hostages, which we continue to do, and we have done ever since. And we will continue to ask for the General Assembly to shoulder its own responsibilities to address this attack. Since the 7th of October, thousands of civilians have been killed, Palestinian civilians have been killed in the military conflict that followed this tragic day. Almost 2 million people have been displaced, and even more are today facing an imminent famine. The breadth of the humanitarian crisis, we must admit this, we must say it, is catastrophic. Canada deplores the loss of all lives, and we will continue our efforts to ensure that the rights of Israelis and Palestinians are protected in all of our activities and policies.
An immediate ceasefire is urgently needed. Hostages must be released. Rapid, safe, and unimpeded humanitarian relief must be provided to civilians. Israel should refrain from further military operations in Rafah, which are already bringing devastating humanitarian consequences. Canada's approach to this crisis and to this vote today is guided by three key principles. The first is that Israel has the right to exist and to defend itself in accordance with international law. Second, that the Palestinian people must be able to realize their right to self-determination. And third, that the protection of civilians everywhere, not just on both sides of this conflict, but in all conflicts everywhere, that protection is paramount and a strict requirement under international humanitarian law. As the General Assembly has considered granting additional privileges for the Palestinian delegation at the United Nations, and recommending that the Security Council reconsider full United Nations membership for Palestine, Canada has decided to abstain today. Let me explain why. We agree with confirming the enhanced participation of Palestinian representatives in the UN, and I must say personally, I have appreciated the flexibility that the Palestinian delegation has shown in finalizing this resolution. We had good, fair, frank, and detailed discussions, and I think they have produced a better resolution as a result. But we still have concerns with this resolution despite best efforts, hence our abstention. It goes too far in determining that Palestinian statehood and a right to full membership has actually, on the ground, in reality, as opposed to in aspiration, that this has actually been achieved. The other fact which we must come to grips with, that Hamas, which many states, including Canada, consider to be a terrorist organization, a view that is totally confirmed by their behavior on October the 7th, it currently controls areas in Gaza, an essential part of the territory of the future state of Palestine. Hamas continues to hold hostages, has yet to lay down its arms or end its violent opposition to the existence of Israel. All Palestinians deserve to be led by a legitimate and representative government without the participation of a terrorist organization. At the same time, the Netanyahu government has made clear in its words and in its actions that it rejects the two-state solution. Illegal settlements and settler violence in the West Bank are growing at alarming rates, often with impunity. We believe there must be continued progress towards Palestinian self-determination, and we will not and cannot afford to give up. It is clear that we must urgently rebuild a credible path to achieving the two-state solution, one that gives hope to both Palestinians and Israelis that they may live side by side in peace, security, and dignity. That process cannot delay indefinitely the creation of a Palestinian state. Canada is prepared to recognize the state of Palestine at the time that is most conducive to lasting peace, and let me make it clear, not necessarily as the last step along that path. There is still work to be done, but Canada's commitment to the two-state solution, including recognition of the State of Palestine when it is appropriate, is very much there. We will also continue to support efforts towards peace and regional stability. We will maximize pressure on Hamas and the Iranian regime, including through sanctions. We will impose sanctions on extremist settlers. We will support strengthening the Palestinian Authority and the introduction of reforms to deliver for Palestinians. We are further committed to supporting the recovery and reconstruction of Gaza in the context of a sustainable peace. The solution also needs to be regional, and it also needs to include the full integration of Israel in the Middle East. Canada will continue working with the international community and will keep at the center of its efforts the need for long-term security guarantees for Israel, as well as the national aspirations of Palestinians. Together, we must redouble our efforts to fully realize the vision that was first articulated by the General Assembly in 1947. We owe it to the Israeli and Palestinian peoples who deserve a brighter future and a sustainable peace. Peace requires, above all, empathy. It requires an understanding of every nation's and every people's search for dignity and for recognition. Let's be very clear. There are many states which still today do not recognize the State of Israel. It has been a member nation of the United Nations since 1948. At the same time, it has taken us a long time to provide Palestinians with the recognition that they deserve to allow them to become a member of not only this organization, but of others. As I've said, that work still rests to be done. But in order to do it, it is going to require a leap of faith and imagination that takes us past some of the words we've heard spoken here today. We must all understand that not all Palestinians are terrorists. And it's important for us to understand that Israelis are a people whose deep suffering, confirmed today earlier in the week with the commemoration of Yom HaShoah, deserve their place as well. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Canada for his statement, and I now invite to the floor the distinguished representative of Cabo Verde.
Thank you, Mr. President. It is my honor to take the floor for a declaration after voting this morning in favor of resolution on the admission of new members to the UN. Cabo Verde voted in favor of the resolution guided by the purposes and principles of the charters of the United Nations and stresses in this regard the principle of equal rights and self-determination for people. We also recognize the importance of maintaining and strengthening international peace founded upon freedom, equality, justice, and respect for the fundamental human rights. Our Constitution underlines that our country, and I quote, is governed in international relations by the principles and respect for international law and human rights, and also it participates in the international fight against terrorism and transnational crime, end of quote. For this reason, my country did not hesitate to condemn the heinous attacks perpetrated by Hamas on October 7, 2023. We also condemn the holding of hostages and reiterate our call for their release. Cape Verde condemns all forms of terrorism and/or extremism and recognizes the right of the State of Israel to live in peace and security, as well as its right to defend itself in compliance with international humanitarian law. We condemn, however, the escalation of violence and destruction that has taken place in Palestine, in particular Gaza, since last October, resulting in dramatic numbers of loss of human life, including children, women, and humanitarian workers. The government of Cabo Verde has always made and continues to make a very clear distinction between extremist movements and the Palestinian people. And Palestinian people should deserve the full support of the international community, especially in the current context of humanitarian catastrophe. For the government of Cabo Verde, it is important that the mechanisms of dialogue for peace are preserved, that humanitarian aid in this context is strengthened, and that the principles of international humanitarian law are observed in strict respect for the Charter of the United Nations and the Geneva Conventions. Cabo Verde recognizes the right of the Palestinian people to establish their own state in accordance with the relevant United Nations resolutions and encourages all efforts to achieve this goal through negotiations. Two states and their respective people living in peace and security, side by side. This is the only durable solution to the conflict. The government of Cabo Verde reiterates its position on the Israel-Hamas conflict and stresses that the Palestinian population must deserve the full support of the international community, especially in the context of the current severe humanitarian situation. For the reasons set out above, Cabo Verde voted in favor of the resolution. Thank you, Mr. President.
I should like to thank the distinguished representative of Cabo Verde, and I now invite to the floor the distinguished representative of Sweden.
Thank you, Mr. President. Sweden remains committed to a just and comprehensive resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, with the State of Israel and an independent, democratic, contiguous, sovereign, and viable State of Palestine living side by side in peace and security and mutual recognition, with Jerusalem as the future capital of both states, in accordance with the relevant resolutions of the Security Council. Sweden's position on the status of the State of Palestine under international law and the Swedish support for a two-state solution remains unchanged. The EU has jointly expressed its commitment to work with partners to end the crisis in Gaza without delay and implement UN Security Council Resolution 2728. We will continue to work for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire, full respect for international law, including international humanitarian law, and the immediate release of all remaining hostages. The humanitarian situation in Gaza is appalling. The entire population is suffering from acute food insecurity. The humanitarian needs are immense, and the delivery of humanitarian aid into and within Gaza must increase radically to prevent further human suffering. We face a terrible crisis in the Middle East, and the UN Charter must be followed. We believe that it would have been better if the regular process in the UN Security Council could have been followed, as now it does not help efforts to achieve a two-state solution. For this reason, Sweden abstained in the vote on this resolution. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
I thank the distinguished representative of Sweden, and I now invite the distinguished representative of Guatemala to take the floor.
Señor Presidente.
President, we are grateful for the convening of the resumed emergency special session. the 10th ESS of the General Assembly of the United Nations to take action on the draft resolution on the admission of new members to the United Nations. President, since 1947, my country has maintained the strong conviction and belief in the peaceful coexistence of the Israeli and Palestinian peoples based on the preeminence of international law in order to achieve a peaceful, comprehensive and definitive solution to this conflict and dispute. This is only possible under the premise of two states, which meets the legitimate concerns for security on Israel's side and allows for the consolidation of a Palestinian state, which is politically and economically viable. We believe that the Palestinian state must live alongside Israel, pursuant to clearly defined, safe, peaceful and internationally recognized borders, pursuant to the relevant resolutions of the United Nations. Upon these tenets, Guatemala, on the 8th of April 2013, recognized the State of Palestine as an independent, sovereign and free nation. President, we recognize the need to seek a peaceful resolution to the conflict and call for this being facilitated by the international community, with the United Nations fostering a political process to promote just, sustainable peace in the region with the involvement of all stakeholders. However, in order to achieve peace in the region, the commission of terrorist acts cannot be tolerated. Guatemala condemns in the strongest terms the attack committed by the terrorist group Hamas on the 7th of October 2023 against the Israeli population. Such acts run counter to all of the principles this organization is built upon. Likewise, we continue to demand the release of all Israeli hostages and hostages of other nationalities who continue in the hands of Hamas since this fateful day. As a state with a robust pacifist stance, we recognize the fact that the response to such attacks cannot mean neglect for the human rights of Palestinian people, nor neglect for the obligations emanating from international humanitarian law. We urge the parties to immediately reach a ceasefire. A ceasefire is not antithetical to the release of hostages. Rather, it is a necessary measure to guarantee both the security and the protection of the rights of the Palestinian people. It is time to move down the path towards a political and not military solution to this dispute. In this regard, Guatemala expresses the importance of guaranteeing access to humanitarian aid in line with the order of the International Court of Justice of the 26th of January 2024 and the obligation to protect Palestinian civilians. President, allow me to reiterate what my country said on the 1st of May to this Honourable General Assembly. The vetoing of the draft resolution on the admission of the State of Palestine as a full member to the United Nations has once again shed light on the paralysis of the highest body in charge of international peace and security, making this meeting a necessity. It is undeniable that the admission of new members, in this case Palestine, to our organization is a step towards seeing peace, security and justice between nations. And taking a decision in this regard must be an act based upon law and not upon subjective considerations. Article 4 of the Charter of this organization establishes a closed list of requirements for the admission of new members. Moreover, the International Court of Justice unequivocally declared, in its advisory opinion of the 28th of May 1948, that member states may not subordinate the admission of a new state to the organization to the satisfaction of conditions which are not laid forth in this article. In the case at hand, these precepts have not been duly abided by. President, finally, I wish unequivocally to reiterate the urgent need to bring an end to all indiscriminate attacks and to seek a peaceful, negotiated outcome to this long-standing conflict. We are faithful to the principle of peaceful dispute settlement, and Guatemala therefore expresses its willingness to support any efforts which work to establish a lasting peace in the region, entrenched in mutual respect and fully abiding by international law. It was for these reasons that Guatemala supported the draft resolution entitled Admission of New Members to the United Nations. Thank you very much.
I should like to thank the distinguished delegate of Guatemala. And now I invite to the floor the distinguished delegate of Barbados.
Mr. President, Excellencies, colleagues, Barbados voted in favor of this important General Assembly resolution. Barbados strongly supports Palestine's application to join the UN as a full member. In this regard, we must register our regret at the veto that was cast in the Security Council and which has triggered today's session. The Council must reconsider its decision and allow the state and the people of Palestine to take their rightful place in these United Nations. Mr. President, I also take this opportunity to inform this Assembly that 3 weeks ago, the government of Barbados decided to recognize and establish diplomatic relations with the State of Palestine. We do this because we firmly believe in the right of self-determination of the Palestinian people, in their right to live in safety and security. We also firmly believe in the right of the state and the people of Israel to exist in safety and security, and have repeatedly condemned the attacks of 7 October 2023. As we gather at this grave moment for our brothers and sisters in the Middle East, with your permission, I would like to make 2 further points. First, we reiterate our earlier calls, the calls of the Caribbean community, the calls of countless other countries, the calls of the UN Secretary General, the calls of this very Assembly for an immediate and lasting ceasefire in the war in Gaza. We also reiterate the many calls for the immediate, unconditional release of all hostages and the provision of humanitarian assistance in all its dimensions to the people of Gaza. This surely is a condition for any further developments in this terrible conflict that has cost thousands of innocent lives on both sides. It is also, in our view, an essential condition for any broader settlement for the Middle East as a whole. Second, the parties to this conflict must now, even in the face of the death and destruction that they are visiting upon one another, come together to find a path to a lasting peace in the Middle East. This requires all parties and their allies to negotiate in good faith with the welfare of the people of Palestine and Israel as their guiding principle. At the heart of this lasting peace is a viable Palestinian state in accordance with UN resolutions and international law, a state that should be, in accordance with today's resolution, a full member of the United Nations. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Barbados, and I now invite to the floor the distinguished representative of Papua New Guinea.
Mr. President, my delegation respectfully notes with interest the various positions of UN member states and observer states on the issue of Palestine's statehood, including in the Security Council last month, that prompted the General Assembly to address this issue today. For Papua New Guinea, we have formal ties with both Israel and Palestine. Mr. President, Papua New Guinea remains concerned with the serious state of affairs in Palestine and Israel, given the ongoing humanitarian, peace and security challenges and the continuing impact on lives and livelihoods of both Palestinians and Israelis alike, and also its wider implications for the Middle East region and beyond. We therefore reiterate our call for the unconditional release of all the October 7, 2023 hostages still held by Hamas and others. we also reaffirm our call for the settlement of the ongoing serious situation through peaceful means. We further encourage direct negotiations, including through the two-state solution, between all relevant stakeholders in Israel and Palestine towards finding a mutually amicable and lasting political solution for Israel and Palestine to live side by side in peaceful coexistence rather than talking past each other. Mr. President, today Papua New Guinea voted no to the emergency special session resolution that we are now discussing. Our vote is also based on our view that any rights and privileges to be granted to parties seeking United Nations membership and their obligations arising from such undertaking must be accorded in a manner that is fully in accordance and compliant with the Charter of the United Nations. Circumventing the Charter for any purpose and repeatedly whilst professing its importance is a serious matter not to be taken lightly in our considered view. Mr. President, Papua New Guinea, as a member of the non-aligned movement, would like to place on record our position, regrettably, on the statement to be delivered by the distinguished delegation of Uganda as chair of the non-aligned movement. Papua New Guinea disassociates itself from the non-aligned movement statement on today's 10th emergency special session and related draft resolution, as elements therein are inconsistent with our national position on the issues addressed today. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Papua New Guinea, and I now invite to the floor the distinguished representative of Mexico.
Señor Presidente.
President, dear colleagues, between 1947 and today, no other matter has taken up so much of the United Nations' attention as the question of Palestine has. Since that year, the vast majority of the members of this organization have agreed here that the existence of two states, one Jewish, the other Arab, is one of the indispensable conditions to put an end to the conflict in the Middle East. Such is the mandate of Resolution 181/Roman 2, which resulted in the creation of the State of Israel in 1948, and then its admission into this organization with the support of my country. In line with this vision, Mexico has on repeated occasions expressed its support for the decisions of this General Assembly, which contribute to consolidating the Palestinian state represented by the National Palestinian Authority. Today, we renew our commitment to a just peace in the Middle East by voting in favor of expanding Palestine's rights in the General Assembly. And we reiterate our call upon the Security Council to positively consider the request of admitting Palestine as a full member of this organization. By declaring in its recently adopted resolution the fact that Palestine fulfills the conditions provided for in Article 4 of the Charter, Mexico believes that a further veto to admission by the Security Council would lack grounds. We urge the permanent members of the Council to honor the statement of June 1945, which committed to not use, and I quote, its veto power with the deliberate purpose of hindering action by the Council, end of quote. To those who insist that the conditions are not fulfilled currently to move forward towards peace, I remind them that the states represented here are those first responsible for creating these conditions. I therefore urge the parties to the conflict to resume the political process with the support of the international community as soon as possible, so as to bring an end to the risky and destructive spiral of violence which we're currently seeing. President, Mexico reiterates its unequivocal condemnation of the terrorist attacks perpetrated by Hamas on the 7th of October last year against Israeli civilians, including women, children, and older people, and calls for the unconditional release of all hostages, which still include one Mexican national. We echo the call by the Special Representative of the Secretary General of the United Nations on sexual violence in conflict. The call to allow for the entry of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights and the International Independent Investigation Commission. We also reject indiscriminate attacks and violence which the Palestinian civilian population has been subjected to by Israel. Mexico condemns the military offensive against Rafah and is aware of the humanitarian catastrophe and the regional escalation which this could result in. All the parties, including non-state groups, are compelled to abide by international humanitarian law. My delegation calls for an independent investigation around the alarming reports of mass graves discovered near the Al-Shifa and Al-Nasser hospitals. Mexico, alongside Chile, has requested the International Criminal Court to investigate the situation in Gaza. We firmly believe that those who are responsible for criminal behavior should be brought to justice. Victims have a right to justice and accountability. This is fundamental for the success of future efforts towards reconciliation. For Mexico, the peaceful outcome to this spiral of violence lies in negotiation. We therefore support the idea that an international peace conference be organized so that the parties return to the negotiating table. In this regard, we support diplomatic efforts underway to achieve a permanent ceasefire and the unconditional release of all hostages. Mexico reaffirms its support for the resolution of this conflict, which involves the existence of two states, guarantees Israel's security, and allows for the consolidation of a Palestinian state, which is politically and economically autonomous and lives side by side with Israel within internationally recognized borders, pursuant to the relevant resolutions of the United Nations. We welcome Palestine as a full member of this organization. This will contribute to reaching a definitive solution to a problem which has afflicted the international community for too many decades. I thank you very much.
I thank the distinguished representative of Mexico for his statement, and I now invite the distinguished representative of Jamaica to take the floor.
Mr. President, let me begin by thanking you for reconvening this 10th emergency special session of the General Assembly today. On the 22nd of April 2024, the government of Jamaica took the decision to recognize the state of Palestine. With Barbados having done so a few days earlier, and Trinidad and Tobago and the Commonwealth of the Bahamas joining the list of UN member states that recognize the state of Palestine, it is worthy of note that all 14 CARICOM member states have now recognized Palestine. Mr. President, consideration of the question of Palestinian membership in the UN must be made in the context of recent developments in the Middle East. Notably, the attacks by Hamas on Israel on 7th October 2023, and Israel's sustained military response in Gaza since that time. The government of Jamaica not only condemned the abhorrent action of Hamas, but joined the international community in reiterating our deep concern about the significant loss of lives and the dislocation and the still unfolding humanitarian crisis arising from the ongoing hostilities in Gaza. We have been lending our voice to efforts at the regional and multilateral levels to bring an end to the hostilities, to ensure that the humanitarian crisis is addressed as a matter of urgency. Jamaica has also supported several United Nations resolutions on the situation in Palestine and supported the invocation by the Secretary General of Article 99 of the Charter to have the Security Council consider the unfolding humanitarian crisis. We have also consistently called for the release of all hostages. Palestine's renewed request on the 2nd of April for the formal consideration by the Security Council of its application for UN membership follows an unsuccessful application for membership in 2011. In 2012, Palestine was granted the status of UN Permanent Observer by the General Assembly, a position which Jamaica also then supported. Mr. President, Jamaica's position on this matter is based on our commitment to the UN Charter, our strong advocacy for the right of peoples to self-determination, our fundamental belief in multilateralism and the rule of law, and the promotion of human rights and international humanitarian law. We have long maintained a balanced position in support of a peaceful resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict with a two-state solution which guarantees the security of Israel and the right of Palestine to an independent, viable, and sovereign state within the pre-1967 borders, pursuant to UN Security Council resolutions 242 and 338. Mr. President, I also want to make it clear that Jamaica's recognition of Palestine is not an endorsement of Hamas, whose posture and constant refrain has been one that calls for the destruction of Israel. We reject that unconscionable ideology, as we reject the use of terrorism in all its forms. Our support for Palestine is within the context of our recognition of the Palestinian Authority as the internationally recognized representative of the Palestinian people, and our belief that the promotion of a two-state solution will be strengthened by their recognition. In light of the foregoing, Jamaica voted in favor of the resolution, and we reiterate our position that the State of Palestine should be accorded full membership of the UN, in accordance with the UN Charter and consistent with the established procedures and practice of the organization. We therefore join the call for the Security Council to reconsider the application for membership of the State of Palestine, taking due note of the position expressed by the General Assembly here today. In the interim, we further support the enhanced participation of the State of Palestine as an observer state in the activities of the General Assembly, as set out in the annex to the resolution. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Jamaica, and I now invite to the floor the distinguished representative of Kenya.
Mr. President, the Palestinian people honor us with their application to become full members of the United Nations. Kenya was proud to vote for today's historic resolution enabling additional rights and privileges to the state of Palestine, and to urge the Security Council to reconsider this application as soon as possible. For decades, we have supported the right of the Palestinian people to self-determination. After all, our very identity as a free people, as an independent state, was forged from self-determination. When the United Nations was created in 1945, we were a colonial territory in which formerly free nations were under the brutal yoke of an imperial power. It was our struggle for independence as African nationalists, joined with other worldwide struggles, that won us independent Kenya. We cannot deny others who legitimately seek self-determination any more than we can deny our very being as a nation. The Palestinian people aspire for all facets of their governance to be sovereign and peace-loving, and to be reflected in a state that embraces the obligations of full membership, as demanded by Article 4 of the UN Charter. However, in the embattled Gaza and the increasingly troubled West Bank, the elusive grace of peace is a distant dream. The brutalities of the October 7th Hamas assault on Israel, which claimed over 1,200 lives and led to the abduction of 240 civilians and soldiers, stands as a grievous chapter in the annals of conflict. This act of terror, which Kenya sternly and unequivocally condemns, is a stark violation of the sanctity of life and peace. Terrorism, irrespective of its professed justifications, is a scourge that erodes the pursuit of negotiation, inquiry, mediation, conciliation, arbitration, judicial settlement, resort to regional arrangements, or other peaceful means that we have embraced as members of the United Nations. Following the devastating assault by Hamas, Israel's justified military response has had immense ethical, legal, and humanitarian consequences. Sadly, the scale and intensity of the military operations in Gaza have led to severe humanitarian harms, with multiple reports indicating that many of the casualties are non-combatants, with a distressing number being children. The logistical restrictions imposed on Gaza by Israel have severely limited access to essential services and goods for the non-combatant population. The impact on non-combatants, on critical civilian objects, and on humanitarian workers, including those working for the United Nations, have frequently deviated from international law and international humanitarian law. Mr. President, over the years, Kenya has consistently backed multiple resolutions that advocate for Palestinian statehood and self-determination. Our commitment is firmly held, reflecting our belief that full membership in the UN is foundational to any state's sovereignty and equality. We therefore urge a united Security Council to play its role in supporting the conditions for the secure and peaceful existence of Palestinian independence. These efforts must begin with an immediate humanitarian ceasefire in Gaza, the unconditional release of all hostages, followed by a resumption of dialogue without preconditions aimed at realistically achieving the two-state solution. This approach is not merely a pathway to peace, but a strategic necessity that addresses the core aspirations of both Israelis and Palestinians. We urge all states, leaders, and organizations with influence on Israeli and Palestinian leadership to make every effort to encourage and facilitate a ceasefire and the resumption of dialogue. This is the only way to marginalize extremists who find relevance and agency in violence. It would empower leaders who understand that the peace their people deserve can only come from recognizing the peace that the opposite side also deserves. Kenya has experienced the devastating loss and outrage following terrorist attacks on our citizens. We fully empathize with Israel's security concerns. However, we also recognize that counterterrorism with no limits makes future acts of terror almost inevitable. We condemn all military actions by Israel that are at odds with international law and international humanitarian law that have been undertaken in the past and all that will follow. We therefore, in this vein, strongly urge Israel to refrain from an assault on Rafah, where a large number of displaced non-combatant civilians have sought refuge, as such an action could risk atrocities and crimes against humanity due to the inevitable significant civilian casualties and immense humanitarian repercussions. Meanwhile, Hamas's continued holding of hostages is not only a violation of international law, but also a gross act of cruelty that demonstrates their disregard for human life. Hamas must release all hostages immediately and relinquish its claims to political and administrative leadership. Its reign of terror must end to pave the way for leaders who genuinely seek negotiation, dialogue, and reconciliation as part of a process leading to the Palestinian people's self-determination and statehood. A peace-loving state of Palestine cannot include an organization committed to the destruction of a people who murder civilians and oppress their own in the name of a cause. We recognize the Palestinian Authority as the rightful representative of the people of Palestine. As we look to the future, we hope to pave the way for the next resolution on Palestine's full UN membership to reflect not just hope, but real progress towards lasting peace and mutual respect. Mr. President, as I close, we are at a fork in the road. This organization was created by the most powerful in 1945 with a promise to those most oppressed and vulnerable. We must decide whether the dictates of those with the most power will define our way forward. That way will lead to a dangerous, deadly, dignity-killing multipolarity. We must stand together for the Charter and resist its shredding as our key defense for a world in which the most powerful are impelled to lawful conduct. This vote for Palestine is a vote for the promise of the United Nations. Thank you.
I should like to thank the distinguished representative of Kenya for his statement. We have now heard the last speaker in explanation of vote after the vote. As agreed earlier, the Assembly will now resume its debate on Agenda Item 5. In respect of which, I now invite the distinguished representative of Mauritania to take the floor, speaking on behalf of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation.
Mr. President, I have the honor to deliver this statement on behalf of the group of member states belonging to the Organization of Islamic Cooperation in my capacity as a chair of the group. Mr. President, let me begin by commending you for the resumption of the 10th Emergency Special Session to deliberate on the ongoing Israeli aggression against the Palestinian people in the Occupied Palestinian Territory, including the Gaza Strip. The United Nations and all peace-loving countries of the world have made unrelenting effort with regard to the ongoing escalation of violence and the resultant humanitarian catastrophe in Palestine, particularly in Gaza. This situation has continued to deteriorate owing to the absence of a decisive response by the United Nations Security Council. This is despite the clarion calls by world leaders and world public opinion on the need for an urgent action in the face of the colossal loss of innocent lives, including the looming threat of starvation and ethnic cleansing in the Palestine occupied territory. It is rather unfortunate that despite the rays of hope that followed the adoption of the resolution of this august body on 26 October 2023 and 12 December 2023, as well as the Subcommittee Security Council Resolution 2728 of 25 March 2004 to 2024 on ceasefire in Gaza, the atrocities of the occupying power against the Palestinian civilian population in Gaza have multiplied considerably. The numbers of martyrs, majority of whom are women and children, has reached an unprecedented figure of 35,000 as at the last count. In addition to injuring more than 75,000 people and displacing hundreds of thousands more who have since fled their home in Gaza. Israeli forces have launched a military attack on the city of Rafah, which houses more than 1 million inhabitants. In this regard, we condemn the Israeli military attack on Rafah, and we demand an immediate ceasefire and a halt to all Israeli military activities. Mr. President, there is no doubt that the convening of this meeting has become necessary due to the failure of past démarches to secure a lasting ceasefire in Gaza and to mitigate the untold suffering of the civilian population in Gaza Strip. Since the adoption of the resolution by the last emergency special session, the series of diplomatic measures within the United Nations have not led to decisive action by the United Nations Security Council to stem the dangers of starvation and ethnic cleansing in Gaza and elsewhere in the occupied Palestinian territory. Regrettably, the resolution of United Nations Security Council, which called for a humanitarian ceasefire during the past month of Ramadan, has remained largely unimplemented, while the draft resolution calling for the granting of permanent membership of the State of Palestine was defeated owing to the veto cast by a permanent member of the Security Council. Notwithstanding the foregoing gloomy picture, we wish to hereby reiterate our appreciation for the measures taken by the United Nations Secretariat for providing relief and humanitarian assistance to the besieged Palestinian people of Gaza. In this regard, we commend the support services provided by the United Nations Relief Agency, UNRWA, and commissary with the Secretary General and families of those aid workers who made the ultimate sacrifice in Palestine. This humanitarian service have remained very valuable, and they provide relief as well as a social and humanitarian service to the inhabitants of the occupied Palestinian territory. In the face of persistent military aggression and organized terrorism by Israeli settlers supported by the occupying power. Taking this opportunity with which to congratulate UNRWA on the latest report of the Independent Review Panel, which confirmed the agency adherence to the effective procedure and mechanism to promote the values of the United Nations humanitarian principle of neutrality. We are convinced that this latest report has put paid to the campaign of calumny launched by the Israeli authority to instigate member states against UNRWA, so as to discontinue its invaluable life-saving services to the Palestinian people. In this regard, we commend those countries who have recently received their financial contribution to UNRWA, including those who have made additional contribution to the agency. We equally urge member states to review their position on the agency in the light of this revelation, so that UNRWA can continue to render his humanitarian services to millions of Palestinian refugees, among others. Equally commendable is the overwhelming support of more than 140 UN member states for the admission of the State of Palestine as a full-fledged member of the United Nations Organization, as more countries included Jamaica, Barbados, and Trinidad and Tobago, and Commonwealth of Bahamas have recently announced the recognition of the State of Palestine. Mr. President, there is no further proof of the failure of the United Nations Security Council to discharge his charter responsibility on the maintenance of peace and security in Middle East than its latest inability to recommend the application of Palestine as a full-fledged member state of the United Nations. The non-adoption of the draft resolution on 18 April 2024 through a veto, despite the positive votes of the overwhelming majority of members of the Council, is indeed a regrettable contradiction of the internationally agreed two-state solution to the Israeli-Palestinian crisis, in line with the relevant United Nations resolution. Given this stalemate at the United Nations Security Council, the General Assembly is better placed to assume its role under the uniting of peace principle and sustain the momentum of the peace process in Middle East. To this end, we reiterate the OIC call on all members of the United Nations to support the adoption of practical measures aimed at putting maximum pressure on the Israeli authorities to comply with the international consensus on the restoration of the inalienable right of the Palestinian people, including the right of return and the establishment of independent state of Palestine along the border of June 1967 with East Jerusalem as its capital. This practical measure included the implementation of previous resolution of emergency special session, especially provision bearing on the humanitarian ceasefire and access of the besieged people of Gaza, protection of civilian population, and prevention of the further escalation of violence and the exercise of maximum restraint, among other measures. We also call on the member state to continue to encourage the Security Council to assume its primary responsibilities in bringing about a permanent ceasefire by supporting the convening of international peace conference to chart the path for a comprehensive, expeditious, and durable resolution of the Palestinian peace process. In addition to the foregoing, the OIC commands all member states which have supported the ongoing judicial process at the International Court of Justice and urge them to continue to demand the immediate implementation of the provisional measure issued by the court against the Israeli Occupied Territory of Palestine. In addition, we call on the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court to expedite the criminal investigation into war crimes against the Palestinians in the Occupied Palestinian Territory as demanded by some members of the United Nations. Similarly, and within the context of application of practical and deterrent measures, we call on the high contracting party to the Fourth Geneva Convention to assume the responsibility under the Article 1 of the Geneva Convention to prevent the grave violation committed by the Israeli Occupation Authority against Palestinians. In addition, we request the United Nations Secretary General to include the Israeli Occupation Army in the appendix of UN Secretary General Annual Report on Children and Armed Conflict for parties that commit grave violation against children. In this regard, we reiterate the call by the Joint Arab-Islamic Extraordinary Summit on member states of United Nations to exert diplomatic, political, and legal measures and take necessary deterrent measures to stop the crimes of Israeli Occupation Authority against humanity in the occupied Palestinian territory in Gaza. These foregoing additional options are practical measures and crucial to desire strengthening of the Middle East peace process and the long-delayed restoration of the national right of the Palestinian people. I wish to conclude by commending the adoption today of the resolution on expansion of the membership of Palestine in the United Nations and look forward to the immediate implementation of this resolution leading to the admission of Palestine as a full member. I thank you.
I should like to thank the distinguished representative of Mauritania, and I now invite to the floor the distinguished representative of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela, speaking on behalf of a group of friends in defense of the Charter of the United Nations.
Señor Presidente.
President, the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela has the honor of taking the floor on behalf of the group of friends in defense of the Charter of the United Nations. President, despite the long-standing international consensus enshrined in countless General Assembly and Security Council resolutions on the question of Palestine, the recent developments show that independence and rights of the Palestinian state have actually been obstructed over almost 57 years of colonization and annexation by Israel. This is a fact which is even acknowledged by the leaders of the occupying power themselves. This systematic violation of their right to self-determination is part of the oppression of the Palestinian people. Today, responsible members of the international community have an opportunity to honor our promise of independence to the Palestinian people, to repair this historic injustice with concrete, practical and positive steps. President, for over 76 years, Israel has refused to recognize the very existence of the Palestinian people, and much less their rights to self-determination. For over 76 years, the occupying power has done it all, from apartheid and occupation policies to illegal settlements, from sieges and blockades to home demolitions, from military brutality and terror and widespread terror to war crimes and crimes against humanity, all with the clear objective of obstructing the two-state solution and the independence and definitive sovereignty of the State of Palestine, with East Jerusalem, Al-Quds al-Sharif, as its capital, with the pre-1967 borders, which is the cornerstone of a just and lasting solution. These criminal policies and practices, endured by the Palestinian people with great resilience and dignity, are a demonstration of Israel's conviction that it is above the law, and that it can violate this law without accountability for its acts. This dangerous perception is the result of years of impunity, which have merely emboldened the occupying power to continue with its colonial plans of expansion and the annihilation of the Palestinian people through violence and terror, in clear contempt of the tenets enshrined in the Charter of the United Nations, the most basic norms of international law, including international humanitarian law, and the resolutions of both the General Assembly and the Security Council concerning the question of Palestine. These, in particular, are legally binding and must be fully respected and immediately implemented by Israel. The disdain of the occupying power for international law is no less than the result of a framework of impunity which historically has been facilitated to it by one of the permanent members of the Security Council, the United States of America, which recently vetoed the admission of the State of Palestine as a full member state of the United Nations, in spite of the support of the resounding majority of that body. It is precisely this veto that Israel de facto exercised through one of its closest allies within the body mandated by the Charter of the United Nations to maintain international peace and security. This is what has allowed the occupying power to believe that it should have a say in the question of the independence and sovereignty of the State of Palestine, and in its admission to the United Nations as a full member state. Israel believes that it can thwart the realization of this right indefinitely. President, a few voices have recently claimed that it is premature to take action on the question of the admission of the State of Palestine as a full member state of the United Nations. To these countries, which today are the main obstacle to peace and stability, both in Palestine and in the Middle East as a whole, we would ask, how could a decision on this matter be premature? After 12 years since the State of Palestine submitted its application for admission to membership to the Security Council. How could it be premature when Palestine, a peace-loving state within the meaning of Article 4 of the Charter, has spent the past 50 years in waiting as an observer in this organisation? How could it be premature to advance towards the realisation of the legitimate national aspirations of the Palestinian people when these have been delayed for over 75 years? President, we cannot continue to perpetuate ad infinitum this matter, and therefore we demand that if indeed there is a political will, as is claimed, words and promises must be translated into concrete actions, which must finally bring an end to one of the most painful conflicts of our times. Returning to the previous status quo is not an option. The situation on the ground is calamitous and dramatic, particularly over the last 7 months, in which we have all witnessed a horrifying carnage against the Palestinian people in Gaza, which has claimed the lives of nearly 35,000 civilians, particularly women and children. It is necessary to urgently reach a ceasefire that would allow for full, unhindered and safe humanitarian access in the Gaza Strip, but also to preserve a political horizon, to establish a platform for the liberation of the Palestinian people from Israel's colonial oppression. This platform would precisely be the admission of the State of Palestine, today recognized by 144 nations, as a full member state of the United Nations. Therefore, for all of the above reasons, we conclude by reiterating our firm commitment to the just cause of Palestine, as well as our full solidarity with the heroic Palestinian people in their struggle. And we also urge that the question of the admission of the State of Palestine as a full member state of the United Nations be addressed as an act of justice and decolonization, which will allow for the realization of the inalienable rights of the Palestinian people to freedom, self-determination and independence. An act which allows the State of Palestine to take its rightful place among the international community. I thank you, President.
I thank the representative of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela, and I now invite to the floor the distinguished representative of Uganda, speaking on behalf of the non-aligned movement.
Mr. President, Excellencies, I'm delivering this statement on behalf of the 121 member states of the non-aligned movement. Mr. President, you recall the resumption of the 10th emergency special session on December 12, 2023, and the subsequent adoption of the General Assembly of Resolution A/RES/ES 10/22, entitled Protection of Civilians and Upholding Legal and Humanitarian Obligations. The General Assembly convenes once again, uniting for peace in this emergency special session in view of the veto cast in the United Nations Security Council on 18th April 2024, once again blocking Council action. This time, on the recommendation for the admission of the State of Palestine as a full member of the United Nations, further obstructing the international community's prolonged efforts to redress this urgent matter of international peace and security, and undermining the mandate of the Council in this regard. The military actions of Israel, the occupying power in the Gaza Strip, has led to mass killings and forced displacements of 2/3 of the Palestinian population in Gaza. Over 34,000 Palestinians have been killed in the Gaza Strip in the period between October 2023 and April 2024, and over 70% of whom are children and women. In addition, over 77,000 Palestinians have been injured in bombardments by the Israeli occupying forces. Over 1.9 million have been displaced, and the entire population is in dire need of humanitarian assistance. The conflict has also become a danger to humanitarian workers, medical personnel, and journalists. NAM deplores the punitive and inhuman siege imposed by Israel on the Gaza Strip depriving the Palestinian civilian population of basic needs, including access to food, water, medicines, and fuel, causing widespread hunger and diseases and onset of famine and epidemics. NAM condemns the Israeli military attack on Rafah and warns against its catastrophic ramifications. The refuge of the over 1.4 million Palestinians, which will result in yet another massacre against 2.3 million Palestinians who are starving due to the Israeli siege in Gaza. In this regard, NAM calls on the international community to collectively act to halt such an attack immediately. Mr. President, NAM reaffirms its long-standing, common, and principled position on the question of Palestine and is deeply concerned about the implications of the conflict in Gaza to the region. Action must be taken immediately to help de-escalate this volatile situation. This must include a halt to all unilateral and unlawful measures by Israel, the occupying power, in the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem. Actions that violate the Security Council resolutions, including violations of the historic and legal status of Jerusalem and its holy sites, are provocative, dangerous, and destroy the prospects for peace, international law, including humanitarian and human rights law, must be respected, and the Palestinian civilian population must be protected. Mr. President, NAM calls for the admission of the state of Palestine on the basis of the two-state solution based on the June 4th, 1967 borders as a just and viable path to peace. An independent state of Palestine will restore the dignity of the people of Palestine as a full member state of the United Nations with sovereign rights, privileges, and obligations alongside all other nations in the international community. We call on all countries that have not recognized the state of Palestine to do so forthwith as an expression of their sincere commitment to peace and their respect to international law and legality in accordance with the relevant United Nations resolution. Mr. President, NAM gravely concerned about the failure to end Israel's aggression and siege on Gaza and grave breaches of international law, including humanitarian and human rights law, being perpetrated, and not with alarm the warnings by the United Nations Special Rapporteurs of an unfolding genocide in the Gaza Strip. We also note of the case initiated by South Africa, a member of the movement, against Israel at the International Court of Justice, seeking provisional measures to hold the aggression against the Palestinian people and stress the imperative of accountability for all war crimes and crimes against humanity. Now member states once again demand an immediate ceasefire and full implementation of Security Council resolutions 2712, 2720, and 2728. Reiterate their call for the continued provision of the needed humanitarian and socio-economic assistance to the Palestinian people, including the Palestinian refugees. The movement reaffirms the continued indispensability of the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestinian Refugees in the Near East, UNRWA, along with other United Nations agencies and international organizations in alleviating their plight, and urges the international community to provide the agency with sufficient and predictable funding, ensuring the continuity of UNRWA and its significant contribution to regional stability is in accordance with its General Assembly mandate, must be of concern to all of us. To conclude, Mr. President, the movement seizes this opportunity to reiterate its call for collective international effort to uphold international law to bring an end to this historic and grave injustice. Now member states reaffirm their commitment in promoting a just, lasting, comprehensive, and peaceful solution to the question of Palestine in all its aspects, including for the plight of the Palestinian refugees, and reaffirm their support for the Palestinian people in their struggle to achieve justice and fulfill their inalienable rights and legitimate national aspirations, including to self-determination, freedom, and independence in their sovereign and independent state of Palestine, with East Jerusalem as its capital, and stand ready to cooperate with and support the Security Council and the General Assembly for the fulfillment of all their respective responsibilities in this regard. I thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. President, thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Uganda for his statement. And I now invite to the floor the distinguished representative of Egypt.
Mr. President, Egypt underlines the content of the UAE statement as head of the Arab group, Uganda as head of the NAM, and Mauritania as head of the OIC. We would like to thank all countries who stood by what's right today and voted for the draft resolution supporting the right of Palestine for full membership at the United Nations. This would provide her with further rights at the UN. Mr. President, dear colleagues, the Israeli war against the Gaza Strip continues. It enters its 8th consecutive month, leading to a record number of Palestinians killed or injured. They totaled more than 34,000 martyrs, most of them women and children. This, in addition to more than 78,000 injured. There is also an unprecedented state of destruction in the Strip to turn it into a ruined area not viable for living. This would push Palestinians to forced displacement. All of this due to a strong Israeli wish to retaliate against the Palestinian people and seize this opportunity to liquidate their noble cause and destroy the occupied territories of Palestine. Today, before you all at the General Assembly, all countries on equal footing, without any veto right, have voted, and we'd like to stress the following. First, what has been committed by the rogue Israeli war machine against Palestinians to commit crimes against humanity that were broadcast by the media left an unprecedented number of martyrs, especially among children. This comes in addition to the mass graves that would lead, without doubt, to an angry Arab generation because of what the Palestinian people have been subjected to. It will lead to a generation that lost hope in the international community and the UN. For there is actually a growing sense that this huge number of civilian martyrs, 12,000 of them were children, would not have happened if those victims were from the aggressor side or any other Western countries. Mr. President, history teaches us, through many lessons and incidents, the repercussions of such boiling sense of injustice. Second, we have to agree that putting an end to this brutal war and preventing crimes against humanity is possible and not difficult, as some say, thanks to the tools available to the international community, tools that have already been used in different incidents, and they must be used today to ensure the supremacy of international law. We have to destroy this Israeli imagination that it is above international law and that it can go without impunity or any punishment. It is not as if it's not compelled to abide by resolutions issued by the Security Council, the General Assembly, the International Court of Justice, or the Human Rights Council. These are resolutions legally binding to stop the war, protect the civilians, and stop the export of weapons to Israel. This would stop these crimes that have reached the UN officials. They have actually killed UN humanitarian workers in a precedent that has never been committed by any member state before, in addition to what has been uncovered recently of mass graves that must be investigated. We warn once again from the repercussions of this growing sense that the Palestinian bloodshedding is acceptable. We warn from belittling the resolutions of the United Nations and their binding nature. Third, Egypt stresses that Palestinian rights are inalienable, including the right to free Palestinian territories and the establishment of a Palestinian statehood along the lines of the 4th of June with East Jerusalem as its capital. This also includes the full membership in the UN. These are inherent and primary rights that are not based on any conditions or related or connected to any political standards. It is based on the equality between people in rights. Thus, we call upon all member states to adopt a resolution that grants the State of Palestine full membership as soon as possible. This would be a resolution that stresses this inherent right. It will not establish a new right. Mr. President, granting Palestine full membership in the United Nations is the best way to revive the peace process and safeguard the two-state solution. Israel has worked hard to end this solution over the past decades, either by relying on illegal settlement building or through crimes and practices committed against the rights of Palestinians, including the seizure of land, the demolition of homes and Palestinian properties, and expelling Palestinians from their own homes. Mr. President, Egypt is the first country that has established peace with Israel from a stance of strength and self-confidence. We were aware of our history and civilization and took such a step to ensure a ceasefire, to ensure access of aid and assistance, and open all humanitarian border crossings in cooperation and coordination with Qatar and the USA. We call upon the international community at large to bring pressure to bear on Israel to respond to the efforts of mediation. We also call upon all those who are keen for stability in the Middle East to condemn and reject any Israeli military operation in Rafah. We must stand against any Israeli schemes aimed at expanding the scope of such military operations. They must come to an immediate stop, which will allow the reopening and reoperation of the Rafah border crossing to ensure humanitarian access in implementation of Security Council resolutions, especially Resolution 2720. Egypt also calls for the resumption of support to the UNRWA and its full funding. Mr. President, dear colleagues, there is no time to lose. No more justifications or false excuses while innocent bloodshedding continues. It is our duty to put an immediate end to this war and to protect civilians and treat the injured. It is our duty to save the innocent and save the credibility of the United Nations. Put an end to the war now. End this aggression before it's too late. Thank you, Mr. President.
I should like to thank the distinguished representative of Egypt for his statement, and I now invite the distinguished representative of China to take the floor.
President, the Palestinian-Israeli conflict has continued in cycles for decades. Generations of Palestinians have lost their home and lived in displacement under occupation. It is a wound of the world that is constantly ripped open and bleeding. Independent statehood has been a long-cherished aspiration of the Palestinian people, and full membership in the UN is a crucial step in this historic process. Palestine should have the same status as Israel, and the Palestinian people should enjoy the same rights as the Israeli people. It is the common responsibility of the international community to support and advance the process of Palestinian independent statehood and provide strong support for the implementation of two-state solution and a lasting peace in the Middle East. Regrettably, Palestine's application for full UN membership was mercilessly vetoed by the US in the Security Council on April 18th. On the Palestinian-Israeli issue, the US has repeatedly used veto in an unjustified attempt to obstruct the international community's efforts to correct the historical injustice long visited on Palestine. It is not commensurate with the role of responsible major country. Today, the GA Emergency Special Session adopted by an overwhelming majority a resolution to reaffirm the right of Palestinian people to self-determination, including the right to their independent state of Palestine, determine that the state of Palestine is qualified for membership in the UN, and recommend that the Security Council reconsider favorably its application to join the UN. China welcomes this historic resolution, which reflects the will of the international community. China joined the co-sponsorship of this resolution. China supports the Security Council's early reconsideration of the application of the State of Palestine as mandated by the GA resolution, expects the relevant country to not create further delays or hurdles. President, the resolution adopted today also includes modalities for the State of Palestine's participation in UN activities and relevant meetings, granting it new rights and privileges. We understand that these are the special modalities decided on for the lack of other options as a remedy for the historical injustice long endured by Palestine and a rectification of the US's abusive use of veto. We believe that these special modalities adopted within the limits permitted by the UN Charter will enable the international community to listen more adequately to the voice of Palestine and help it to talk and negotiate with Israel on a relatively equal footing. The resolution makes it clear that these modalities are adopted on exceptional basis and without setting a precedent. We believe that these modalities will not be permanent because one day the State of Palestine will become a full UN member and will enjoy full and equal rights in the UN like other member states. President, the crux of the intractable Palestinian-Israeli issue lies at the stalled implementation of the two-state solution. Over the years, Israel, as the occupying power, has worked ceaselessly to erode the basis of the two-state solution, and the ongoing conflict, already 7 months long, threatens to completely bury the prospect of the two-state solution. China urges Israel to stop collective punishment of the Gaza population, to halt its military offenses on Rafah, and to effectively remove all restrictions on the entry of humanitarian goods into Gaza. In the West Bank, Israel should cease all settlement activities and effectively curb the rising settler violence. China will continue to play a constructive role and make unremitting efforts for the immediate ceasefire, for the revitalization of the two-state solution, for the early realization of peaceful coexistence of Palestine and Israel, and for the lasting peace and stability in the Middle East. Thank you, President.
I thank the distinguished representative of China, and I now invite to the floor the distinguished representative of the State of Qatar.
Mr. President, would like to thank you for reconvening the 10th Emergency Special Session of the General Assembly. We align ourselves to the statements presented on behalf of the Arab Group, the OIC, and NAM. Mr. President, the State of Qatar expresses its proudness for the adoption of the historic resolution by the General Assembly today with overwhelming majority. We would like to thank all countries that voted for the resolution. We would like to stress that the participation in the adoption of this resolution exemplifies our strong historic and principled position in support of the brotherly Palestinian people and their just cause. The adoption of this resolution represents an important victory to our brothers, the Palestinians. It also provides the Security Council with another opportunity to take a unified position to recommend the admission of the State of Palestine. This resolution reflects the purposes of the UN and resolutions of international legitimacy, especially the right to self-determination, equality in rights between peoples, and the sovereign equality principle. The admission of the State of Palestine as a full-fledged member is a primary step to achieve the two-state solution, which is a primary entry point to reach a just and comprehensive political solution to the Palestinian cause in line with international legitimacy. Mr. President, despite the importance of what has been achieved today, but the Israeli aggression continues on Gaza in clear defiance of the international law, the international humanitarian law, and the resolutions of the Security Council, the General Assembly, and the ICJ. In this vein, we condemn in the strongest terms the bombardment of the Israeli occupation forces of Rafah and their ground offensive against the crossing point and the threat of forcefully displacing the people from their shelters. We call upon the international community to avoid such ground operation and the committing of a genocide and provide protection to civilians in line with international law and international humanitarian law. We warn that forcing civilians to be displaced from this city, which has become the last resort to hundreds of refugees inside Gaza, is a grave violation of international law. It would exacerbate the humanitarian crisis in the besieged Strip. We stress that we will continue our mediation effort with the Arab Republic of Egypt and the USA. We hope that our sincere effort would be fruitful to reach a permanent and immediate ceasefire in Gaza and free all prisoners and detainees and ensure that more humanitarian assistance will reach them constantly. We hope that we'd also provide protection to the civilians. This would pave the way for a serious political process that will lead to a comprehensive settlement of the Palestinian cause. To conclude, Mr. President, we reiterate our historic and principled position in support of the resilience of the Palestinian people and their just cause in line with international legitimacy, in line with the Arab Peace Initiative, which includes Palestinian statehood and independent state along the lines of 1967 with East Jerusalem as its capital. We reiterate our call to the Security Council to take matters in hand and adopt the right decision to recommend the admission of the State of Palestine as a full-fledged member of the UN. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Qatar. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Ireland.
President, dear friends, I would like to thank the United Arab Emirates for tabling this historic resolution, which has been resoundingly endorsed by the members of this General Assembly and by the international community. Let me start by saying that Ireland fully supports this resolution, Ireland co-sponsored this resolution, and Ireland voted in favour of this resolution. 12 years ago, when the General Assembly accorded non-member observer state status to Palestine, an overwhelming majority of states voted in favour. That overwhelming majority of states also made clear their support for full membership of the United Nations for the State of Palestine. And that overwhelming majority of states reaffirmed the right of the Palestinian people to self-determination, which crucially includes the right to an independent state for Palestine. And now, as we return to this issue, in truly desperate circumstances for the Palestinian people, when even as we speak, the suffering and the hunger and the horror continues in Gaza, and when a negotiated settlement that allows both the Palestinian and Israeli peoples to live in peace, security and dignity seems so very, very far away, it is clear that lack of international support for Palestinian self-determination is not the issue. That support is real, it is tangible, here in this chamber, but also far beyond this chamber. The real problem has been the failure over many years to act on this support in a tangible way. The failure of the international community to insist on concrete and irreversible measures and actions to demonstrate that they take the rights and the dignity and the security of the Palestinian people as seriously as they rightly take the rights and the dignity and the security of the Israeli people. We know that the two-state solution remains the only viable option to secure a just and lasting peace that fulfills these rights for both peoples. This chamber must have heard the phrase support for the two-state solution uttered by world leaders, foreign ministers, ambassadors, hundreds of thousands of times. But today is the day that we take one small step to convert that phrase from a comforting platitude into a concrete reality. To declare clearly and unequivocally that Palestine is, as the resolution says, qualified for membership in the United Nations in accordance with Article 4 of the Charter and should therefore be admitted to membership in the United Nations. President, dear friends, we are under no illusions as to the challenge that converting this resolution into reality will entail. There is no easy pathway, no soft solution, no magic solution. In today's vote, we have seen an unambiguous expression of the will of the international community. But it will take a vote of the Security Council to give today's General Assembly vote real meaning and full effect, to enable Palestine to take its rightful place amongst the nations of the world. As a country with hundreds of years of colonial history behind us, hundreds of years of colonial experience, we know exactly how precious is that place amongst the nations. In the 101 years of our existence as an independent state, we have faced partition, civil war, poverty, mass emigration, conflict, terrorism, and deep and abiding political divisions. The freedom to exercise sovereignty does not guarantee peace or progress or prosperity, but it is the starting point on a journey towards those blessings, an essential starting point. And it is a starting point that the Palestinian people have been denied for far too long. President, please allow me briefly to address the argument put forward by Israel that a vote in favour of this resolution at this time is somehow a reward for terrorism or a reward for Hamas. Nothing could be further from the truth. In fact, it is precisely the opposite. Today's resolution is a testament to the power of diplomacy, the power of international law, and the power of the global multilateral system. What Israel has referred to in recent years, and I quote, diplomatic terrorism or legal terrorism, is in reality smart and committed and wholehearted diplomacy. When Palestine brings a resolution to the Security Council or General Assembly, when it utilises the mechanism of the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court, when it successfully advocates for the creation of a commission of inquiry by the Human Rights Council, this is not terrorism. This is not terrorism. This is the polar opposite of terrorism. This is vocal and public declaration that despite the horrors of occupation and of displacement and of dispossession, Palestine will keep faith with the multilateral system, will keep faith with international law, will keep faith with the Geneva Conventions, and yes, will keep faith with the UN Charter. It's a declaration that Palestine will maintain its commitment to using politics and diplomacy and the international legal system and advocacy and the power of persuasion rather than violence and terror. It is the declaration that Palestine will take seriously the obligations and the commitments contained in the international treaties and in the resolutions that we have collectively agreed, and that Palestine will demand of us that we, the 193 member states of the UN, take them seriously too. And Ireland, for one, is inspired and humbled by that example. President, today needs to be a step not just towards full UN membership for Palestine, but towards a comprehensive regional peace, a sustained regional peace, a peace for all. Towards a future where every state in this chamber recognises every other state in this chamber, where instead of 143 states recognising Palestine, and 165 states recognizing Israel, all states recognize both Israel and Palestine. There is a long road to get to that point. It will not be easy. It will mean difficult choices and painful compromises. But it must mean an end to occupation and must mean full adherence to international law by all parties. And vitally, it must mean the equal right to security, to dignity, and to self-determination for the Palestinian and Israeli peoples. Mr. President, that is why we co-sponsored and voted for today's resolution. And that is why Ireland will, in the coming weeks, formally recognise the State of Palestine. I repeat, in the coming weeks, we will formally recognise the State of Palestine. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Ireland. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Saudi Arabia.
Sayyid al-Ra'is.
President, my delegation aligns itself with a statement made by Uganda on behalf of the non-aligned movement, the Islamic Republic of Mauritania, on behalf of the OIC, and the United Arab Emirates on behalf of the Arab Group. President, we'd like to thank you for resuming this 10th emergency special session to consider the resolution presented today, which calls on the Security Council to reconsider the request of admission of the State of Palestine as a full member of the United Nations. Unfortunately, one single vote at the Council on the 18th of April prevented the adoption of the draft resolution submitted by Algeria. We deplore the fact that the Security Council was not able to adopt this resolution. Moreover, the fact of preventing Palestine from becoming a full member of the United Nations means that Israel's obstination will last longer and will worsen the violations of international law and move us further and further away of the peace that we need. President, the United Nations General Assembly annually adopts decisions which reaffirms the right of the Palestinian people, including its right to self-determination. And the resolution presented today is fully in line with those resolutions and seeks to implement the will of the international community and contribute to building a true peace in the Middle East based on the two-state solution. It is high time for the international community to reestablish the truth, because the world can no longer ignore this suffering of the Palestinian people that has lasted for decades. It can no longer ignore their right to self-determination and their determination to obtain the status of a full member of the United Nations. President, Israel, the occupying power, has perpetrated all sorts of crimes against Palestinian people, scorning international law and international legal resolutions. Israel is convinced that they are above these resolutions and that they enjoy a certain level of immunity. This explains their ongoing hostile and brutal policies and their commission of all sorts of crimes. The most recent month is only one chapter of this decades of suffering. Over the last month alone, barbaric practices by Israel have cost the lives of more than 35,000 Palestinians, the majority women and children. This is through bombing, murders, destruction, the use of famine, and this has led to a unprecedented humanitarian crisis, which is only worsening day by day. Now we are seeing the same practices in the town of Rafah, the last refuge of the Palestinian people, a town which has become densely populated because of the forced displacement of Palestinian people. This is why we need a strong international position to put an end to these Israeli practices in Gaza. President, ladies and gentlemen, the resolution adopted today by a vast majority reflects the conviction of the international community of the rights of the Palestinian people, because beyond the moral duty that this resolution provides for, there is a historic right that we need to honour without delay, because it is an essential part of reviving the peace process and putting an end also to barbaric Israeli practices. This is why we would like to thank all peace-minded nations who voted in favour of the draft resolution. By way of conclusion, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia is committed as a founding member of the United Nations, committed to supporting the right of the Palestinian people to self-determination and to build its own independent state within 1967 borders, with East Jerusalem as its capital, for a just and comprehensive peace in line with the Arab Peace Initiative and relevant resolutions under international law. Thank you very much, President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Saudi Arabia. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Indonesia.
Thank you, Mr. President. Our meeting today underscores our commitment to resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflicts through diplomacy. The call to end Israel-Palestine conflict based on a two-state solution also continue to reverberate through this hall. Even the strongest supporter of Israel have called for a two-state solution. It is therefore time for us to walk the talk. If we believe in peace, if we believe in the UN Charter and international law, if we believe in humanity, we must take the brave step to free Palestine, recognize the existence of Palestine, and accept Palestine as a full member of the United Nations. This will allow Palestine to be on an equal footing with Israel in negotiating a two-state solution and bringing lasting peace to the people of Israel and the people of Palestine. The adoption of today's General Assembly resolution shows the readiness of the UN membership to work beyond business as usual, to bring peace, to realize the two-state solution closer to reality. It was also an important step to bring the admission of Palestine as a full member of the United Nations. We must continue to call on the Security Council to take the necessary steps to make this a reality. Mr. President, for 216 days, the people of Gaza have endured brutal Israeli onslaught, resulting in death, destruction, famine, even genocide. Enough is enough. In our multilateral toolbox, we have at least 3 ESS resolutions, 3 Security Council resolutions, and 2 ICJ provisional measures, all aimed at addressing the situation in Gaza. It is time for us to use these tools available to fix the situation in Gaza, prevent further humanitarian catastrophe, and the spillover to a wider region. In this regard, allow me to highlight 2 points. First, we must renew our call for a two-state solution. In the past few weeks, 4 Caribbean states have announced their recognition of Palestine, bringing the tally to 144 countries. This is a testament of strengthening support for the Palestinian cause. With this momentum, peace process must be revived. We must rally behind an international conference to kickstart direct peace negotiation. This is where Palestine's full membership at the UN becomes crucial. There can never be a fair and equitable negotiation until Palestine and Israel stands on equal footing. Second, we must keep pushing for immediate and permanent ceasefire. Stopping the violence in Gaza must continue to be our top priority. This month, 76 years ago, the Nakba took place. We must not be complicit in allowing the millions of Palestinian refugees to experience another Nakba today. We must be resolved in our call to stop the attack on Rafah. All parties involved must work hard to reach an agreement for a permanent ceasefire, provide humanitarian assistance at a scale, and continue supporting UNRWA. Mr. President, let today mark a turning point in history, but let it also lead to a stronger path towards Palestinian rightful place in the global community. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Indonesia. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Brazil.
Mr. President, the day of Palestine's admission to the United Nations as equal among us is finally coming. The resolution adopted today is a meaningful achievement towards full UN membership for the State of Palestine. The determination today by a large majority of the membership that Palestine meets the criteria set out in Article 4 of the Charter and is ready for membership leaves no doubt that the process for Palestinian admission must not linger indefinitely at the Security Council. The General Assembly, the main UN body entrusted with the authority to take the final decision on such matters, must be allowed to exercise its powers under the Charter. A majority of over 2/3 of the votes enabled today's determination. That is the same qualified majority that will manifest itself when the time comes to admit Palestine as a UN member. We are confident that this will happen immediately after the Security Council, as we expect, accepts the recommendation issued by this Assembly today. The recommendation for the Council to reconsider Palestine's request enjoys more than just moral authority and political legitimacy. We recall the 1948 opinion of the International Court of Justice that no member state should be entitled to withhold consent to membership based on political considerations not included among the criteria set out in Article 4, which the Assembly today has determined that Palestine unequivocally fulfills. A politically motivated veto contradicting this Assembly's determination would be unjustifiable. Colleagues, the time has come to fulfill the United Nations promise of a Palestinian state. We can no longer abandon the Palestinians to a fate that is being unilaterally imposed by force by those denying Palestinians their right to self-determination. What we are witnessing in Gaza, now specifically in Rafah, is a shocking reminder of this undeniable reality. Today's resolution, if acted upon by all relevant actors, will pave the way to a future with a viable state of Palestine living side by side with Israel in peace and security within internationally recognized borders, consistent with the relevant United Nations resolutions. As importantly, the admission of Palestine as a member state, to be effected soon, I'm sure, will help restore full trust in the United Nations and in multilateralism. Mr. President, the 10th Emergency Special Session resumed for the 20th time since it was first convened in 1997. It means 27 years of this Assembly's attempting to fill a significant void left by the Security Council in performing its responsibility to address threats to international peace in connection with the situation in the Middle East. For the past 27 years, every time this Assembly convened or reconvened for this emergency session, it has been in response to a blatant failure by the Council to address illegal actions in the occupied state of Palestine. Have we not had enough? Have not the Palestinians suffered enough? Israeli settlements in the West Bank and East Jerusalem are clearly illegal. They alter the demographic composition and status of the Palestinian territory and threaten the prospect of a comprehensive peace settlement in the Middle East. Yet these settlements, which justified our first convening of the 10th Emergency Special Session back in 1997, have continued unabated. And this has only been met with Council inaction, apart from a 2016 resolution that recalls that what we already know: the settlements violate international law. Legal words without action have encouraged further contempt for the law. The occupation lingers on indefinitely, crystallizing a discriminatory system against Palestinians and the annexation of the Palestinian territory. Unlawfulness of actions against Palestinians has become the pervasive reality in the occupied Palestinian territory. The catastrophe in Gaza, whose latest chapter is unfolding in Rafah as we speak, cannot be dissociated from our failure to put an end to this prolonged occupation. It cannot be dissociated from our repeated failure to put an end to violations of international law and ensure compensation for the victims in Palestine. It cannot be dissociated from the United Nations' failure to fulfill the rights of the Palestinian people to self-determination, the same self-determination, statehood, and UN membership that Israelis have enjoyed since 1948. It is clear that the General Assembly's response in the face of Council inaction must go beyond just convening, adjourning, and reconvening the 10th Emergency Special Session. The resolution adopted today should not add to the pile of documents that point to a solution but do little to get us there. Brazil has recognized since 2010 the state of Palestine within the 1967 borders, which includes Gaza, the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, with East Jerusalem as its capital. Brazil is hopeful that as a result of today's resolution, which other bodies of the United Nations shall not ignore, the admission of Palestine as a full member of this organization, bound and protected by the UN Charter, will be achieved soon. That will be an important step, with other steps that must seriously follow in the path towards the realization of the two-state solution. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Brazil. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Japan.
Thank you, Mr. President. The situation in Gaza is worsening by the day. Amid the suffering, destruction, spread of disease, and a full-blown famine in the north, the people in Gaza need an immediate ceasefire and humanitarian assistance more than ever. Considering the already catastrophic humanitarian situation, Japan reiterates that a full-scale Israeli military offensive into Rafah must not proceed. In addition, Japan is closely following the developments in East Jerusalem, including the incident regarding the UNRWA headquarters. UNRWA plays an indispensable role in providing relief to refugees, and such destruction of UN facilities is unacceptable. To prevent further tragedy in Gaza, it is imperative that an agreement for a ceasefire and the release of hostages is achieved as soon as possible. In this regard, we strongly support the ongoing effort made by the United States, Egypt, and Qatar. A cessation of hostilities is the only path that could lead to a peaceful way forward. We believe that an immediate and sustainable ceasefire that includes the release of the hostages remain crucial. A few weeks ago, Japan voted in favor of the proposed draft Security Council resolution that would have recommended Palestine's admission as a full UN member, recognizing that Palestine meets the criteria for admission while also taking into account the perspective of promoting the establishment of the Palestinian state through peaceful negotiations between the parties concerned. Today, Japan also voted in favor of the General Assembly's resolution that grants Palestine additional rights as an observer state on the understanding that these rights are not inconsistent with the framework of the United Nations Charter. These actions reflect our principled position that upholds Palestine's right to self-determination through the establishment of an independent Palestinian state living side by side in mutual peace and security with Israel. We look forward to seeing Palestine, as an observer state, play an even more constructive role at the UN. Mr. President, to conclude, we are at a critical juncture, and our next step will be defining moment for the future of the region. Both Israel and Palestine have a right to exist as peaceful and independent states, and Japan remains unwavering in its support for the two-state solution. Let us exert all our efforts towards the realization of an immediate ceasefire so that peace and stability can be seen on the horizon. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Japan. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Colombia.
Señor Presidente.
President, Colombia underscores the importance of convening this 10th Emergency Special Session of the General Assembly, following the veto by the Security Council on the 18th of April of the Palestinian request to be admitted as a full member of the United Nations. The Charter of the United Nations establishes in its preamble that we, the peoples, are determined to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, which has brought untold sorrow to mankind. With this same end, we commit to practice tolerance and live together in peace with one another as good neighbours. However, the intensification of the conflicts globally calls into question the organization's ability to fulfill its fundamental mandate of maintaining international peace and security. In the Middle East, the spiral of atrocities committed since the attack by Hamas on the 7th of October 2023 must cease. This unacceptable escalation of violence has cost over 34,000 lives and over 78,000 injured. Most of these are women and children. It has led to massive displacements of civilians, famine, and the indiscriminate destruction of vital infrastructure. In this regard, Colombia categorically condemns Israel's attack on Rafah, which will have catastrophic consequences for the over 1.4 million people crowded into the city. The magnitude of the tragedy in the Gaza Strip, its irreparable costs for current and future generations, and its harmful implications for stability and peaceful coexistence in the region are beyond words. A resounding international response is imperative. The members of this organization have the collective obligation of demanding an immediate humanitarian ceasefire, for all the parties to comply with their obligations pursuant to international law and international humanitarian law, for the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages, and guarantees of humanitarian access to the area. Moreover, we are faced with the inescapable imperative of guaranteeing a peaceful, definitive, and comprehensive outcome to the question of Palestine, based upon the two-state solution and pursuant to the borders agreed upon by the United Nations in Resolution 242 of 1967. Given that both Palestinians and Israelis have the right to live in peace within secure, internationally recognized borders. Colombia has advocated for the need to carry out a peace conference to resolve the war in Gaza and to resume the route towards negotiations, which would lead to a permanent resolution to the conflict. And in this regard, Colombia reaffirms the support of the government of Gustavo Petro to this end. President, a fundamental step in order to move closer towards a peaceful, definitive, and comprehensive exit to this conflict is the admission of Palestine as a full member of the United Nations. This request, as we have just witnessed with the vote of 143 member states, is supported by the overwhelming majority of the membership. In echo of the statement by the Permanent Observer State of Palestine to the United Nations, Colombia reiterates that admitting Palestine as a full member of the UN is investing in peace. As a defender of life and of peace, we co-sponsor and support the draft resolution presented by the United Arab Emirates in this session. Colombia urges the Security Council to reconsider its decision on Palestine's request for admission as a full member of the United Nations. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Colombia. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Jordan.
Mr. President, thank you for responding to the request of resuming the 10th Emergency Special Session of the General Assembly of the United Nations. We express our full support to the statements of the Arab Group, the OIC, and the non-aligned movement. Mr. President, Your Excellencies, our session today is held as the Security Council failed to adopt the resolution tabled by Algeria on behalf of the Arab world, the Arab group, last month on accepting the bid by Palestine to become a full-fledged member of the United Nations, and in light of the fact that Israel continues to disregard international norms, humanitarian, moral, legal principles and values. Israel's occupation army has been committing the worst massacres in the Gaza Strip. They claim the lives of 35,000 martyrs, most of them women and children, let alone tens of thousands of injured, those who went missing, those who had to leave their homes, and those who have been orphaned. Mr. President, my country today voted in favor of the resolution tabled by the brotherly UAE as chair of the Arab group this month. We voted in favor of this resolution as we firmly believe, historically have believed, in the right of the State of Palestine to a full membership of the United Nations. We believe in the centrality of the establishment of an independent Palestinian state with East Jerusalem as its capital, along the borders of the 4th of June 1967, according to international resolutions, the Arab Peace Initiative, and the two-state solution. The overwhelming majority of members of the United Nations have voted in favor of this resolution. This reflects clearly the overwhelming support of the international community to the Palestinian right to full membership in the United Nations, and the support of the international community to the rights of the Palestinian people to freedom, to establishing a state, and to self-determination. It is also a clear message to Israel that no matter how much it tries, no matter how much it destroys and kills and oppresses and persists in its arrogance, its injustice, its aggression on the Palestinian people, it would not distinguish the fire of justice. It will not defeat the will of the Palestinian people. Palestine lives on. Despite the naysayers, Israel is not going to be able to challenge international support, despite of its attempt to mislead, to falsify history, despite its attempts to disseminate a narrative that is flawed, that is completely false, its attempts to erase the culture and the Palestinian identity. Mr. President, we have to work to stop the current crimes in Gaza. The Security Council and the international community must act now to stop Israel from invading and attacking Rafah. 1.4 million Palestinians have sought refuge in Rafah as a result of the continued Israeli war for 7 months now, the Israeli war on Gaza. We warn that the attack on Rafah would inevitably lead to the commission of more massacres against innocent civilians, and it portends a spillover of this conflict. There are international protests against the crimes by Israel, and it's against its destruction of large swathes of land in Gaza, which shows that the plight of the Palestinian people is a moral issue faced by the whole world. The international community cannot continue to disregard Israeli violations of the most basic human values of international humanitarian law and the resolutions of this organization. Pressure must be borne to bear on Israel to ensure accountability of the occupying power Israel. Impunity, or rather accountability, is not merely a slogan when it comes to Israel. It must be held accountable. Mr. President, Israel, at the beginning of this week, has controlled the Rafah crossing and closed it completely and prevented humanitarian aid from entering Rafah. This is to enter Gaza. This is a violation of international law and international humanitarian law, and it's an attempt by Israel to ensure the failure of efforts to reach a ceasefire. It's an attempt to obstruct the delivery of humanitarian aid in a sustainable way, and this is unacceptable, especially in light of the increasing needs. We condemn the actions by extremist Israeli settlers. They attacked Jordanian convoys that were going to the north and the south of the Gaza Strip. We also condemn all attacks by settlers yesterday on UNRWA in the occupied Jerusalem. We call upon the Security Council and the United Nations and the international community to take a clear stance and to stop and condemn and to reject these attacks and to impose the implementation of international law, international humanitarian law, without any biases, without any selectivity. We call upon forcing Israel, the occupying power, to fulfill its legal commitments, meaning protecting aid convoys and UN organizations that are distributing this aid. Israel must be compelled to provide protection to UN facilities and stop any attacks on UNRWA and UNRWA staff, who are playing a very important humanitarian role that is indispensable in providing assistance and basic services to Palestinians in the occupied Palestinian territories. In conclusion, Mr. President, we completely and categorically reject the barbaric Israeli war against the Palestinian people and attempts to forcibly display Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank, or to separate Gaza and the West Bank. It is important to stop this war immediately and to stop the continuation of this war using all means enshrined in the United Nations Charter in case there is a threat of international peace and security. Jordan will continue its support to Palestine and its defiant people. We will make all efforts and do our utmost to end the occupation and so that the sun of freedom will shine on Palestinian territories. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Jordan. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Thailand.
Mr. President, Thailand welcomes the convening of the 10th Emergency Special Session of the General Assembly in view of the urgent need to address the various dimensions of the Palestinian question. Thailand reaffirms its unwavering adherence to the UN Charter and international law in its totality. Thailand recognizes the State of Palestine and supports the State of Palestine's aspiration to become a member of the United Nations. Thailand thus voted in favor of and co-sponsored the draft resolution on admission of new members to the UN to demonstrate our commitment to the people of Palestine and to join other member states in sharing sympathy and empathy with the Palestinian cause. We hope that this could translate into a strong political will for the entire United Nations to secure justice for the Palestinian people. Thailand continues to condemn in the strongest terms all forms of violence and attacks on civilians in conflict situations, including capturing and taking them hostage. The military operations in Rafah worsened the already dire humanitarian situation for Palestinians in Gaza. We once again call for an immediate ceasefire. Thailand urges all sides to respect and fulfill their obligations under international humanitarian law and relevant United Nations resolutions. We reiterate the Secretary General's appeal for all sides to, and I quote, show the political courage and spare no effort to secure an agreement now. This is a crucial opportunity that the region and the world cannot afford to miss. Mr. President, Thailand is also deeply concerned over the worsening humanitarian situation in Gaza. Plight of our affected civilians and ongoing escalation of regional conflicts in the Middle East. We continue our plea for the continuation of the provision of humanitarian assistance to those in need in Gaza. Thai nationals have been killed, injured, captured, and held hostage. We remain deeply concerned for the remaining hostages, regardless of their nationalities, and strongly appeal for their immediate release and return, as well as their proper treatment and care pending their release. Therefore, we support ongoing coordinated efforts by concerned parties to secure truth and the release of hostages held in Gaza. We appeal to all sides to seek all avenues possible to resolve the situation and work towards long-term peace through genuine dialogue and diplomacy, with a view to finding a mutually agreed, peaceful solution to the issue. In accordance with the two-state solution, by which the state of Israel and Palestine live side by side in peace and security within secure and recognized borders consistent with relevant UNSC resolutions. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Thailand. And I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea.
Mr. President, I thank you for convening the special session of the General Assembly to debate on the question of the admission of the State of Palestine as a full member state of the United Nations. Today, General Assembly adopted important resolution admitting Palestine as a full member state of the United Nations and recommending the UN Security Council reconsider this matter favorably. The DPRK delegation has voted in favor of the resolution for admissions of new member states of the United Nations. Mr. President, the question of the Palestine has been on the agenda of the United Nations for over 60 years, but no progress has been made due to double standard and hypocrisy of the United States toward the Palestine issue. For over 60 years, the United States has consistently maintained one-sided support policy for Israel at the expense of the right of Palestinian people to self-determination and their aspiration for independence with statehood. This one-sided approach had been evidenced in various aspects of the United States foreign policy, including military aid and the exercise of the veto power at the Security Council. Consequently, it has become the main obstacle to resolving Palestine issues. This double standard and biased approach of the United States not only undermine the credibility of the Security Council, but also perpetuate the cycle of the violence, injustice, and illegal behavior of Israel in occupied Palestinian territory. One of the most typical examples of this double standard is clearly demonstrated in the situation in Gaza, where genocide against innocent Palestinian people is still being committed. It is imperative for international community to take concerted action with one voice to ensure that all countries respect and follow the same rules and norms. If double standard and special rule do not apply in the international relation, the Palestine issue will be smoothly resolved as requested by international community. The only way to realize a two-state solution is to recognize and respect the sovereignty of the Palestine and its right to self-determination. The adoption of the resolution admitting Palestine as a full member state of the United Nations is a critical step toward realizing the vision of the two-state solution, which remains the most visible pathway to lasting peace and stability in the Middle East. Furthermore, granting Palestine a full member state of the United Nations would reaffirm the commitment of the international community to upholding principles of the equality, sovereignty, and the right to self-determination for all peoples. The DPRK delegation strongly supports Palestine's full membership of the United Nations and call upon the Security Council to reconsider favorably this matter in the light of the resolution adopted at this special session of the General Assembly. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Democratic People's Republic of Korea. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Belgium.
Monsieur le
President, Excellencies, dear colleagues, today, more than ever, we must send a strong signal that we are determined to, whatever it takes, take the path towards peace through restoring a credible political horizon. This is why my country, Belgium, co-sponsored this resolution to resolutely choose action. We have the responsibility to work together to relaunch the peace process. There is no alternative to having two democratic states living side by side in peace within safe, secure and recognized borders. There is no other path other than reconciling Israel's security and the aspirations of the people of Palestine to self-determination. We all know this. We cannot postpone this endlessly either. All efforts here must be supported. All those showing goodwill must be supported. In asking the Security Council to reconsider its position on the full admission of Palestine to the United Nations, our General Assembly has sent a strong message of support to a negotiated resolution between two parties as equals. Our Assembly has underscored its determination to work with a Palestinian Authority that must be our own only legitimate interlocutor. It sends a message of hope to all the victims of this conflict, hope that there is an alternative to violence and to war. Our co-sponsorship shows the constant commitment of Belgium for a just, sustainable and peaceful resolution to the Palestinian question and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, fully respecting international law and based on Security Council resolutions. Today's resolution is not an end in itself. It is, on the other hand, a symbolic milestone to make it indisputable that the only possible path is the path of peace. Of course, other stages will be necessary to ensure that a piece of dialogue can emerge and support its evolution. The international community should continue to bring its weight to bear to support these efforts. Palestine's place is within the concert of nations, with us here. That's the point of history and the most fundamental right of the Palestinian people. It's an essential condition to allow a credible peace process. This conviction that we express today goes hand in hand with the necessary efforts of reform to increase the legitimacy and capacities of governance on the part of the Palestinian Authority. It's in taking this path that we will be able to make a reality for a full membership of Palestine within the United Nations. And when the time comes, my country, Belgium, in coordination with its partners, will be able to recognise the state of Palestine. President, Excellencies, dear colleagues, an assault in Rafah would sacrifice all of our hopes of a ceasefire and of seeing hostages released. It would force us to bear witness to a new humanitarian disaster. Every day this conflict drives back the limit of what is unacceptable. Inaction can no longer be an option. Our inaction plays into the hands of the enemies of peace. It means that this intolerable humanitarian situation lasts longer, and that will only benefit terrorist groups such as Hamas and all types of extremists. Belgium reiterates its will to continue to contribute proactively and positively to ensure that peace returns. It's in this context that we reiterate our appeal for an immediate ceasefire, an unconditional release of hostages, and complete and unhindered humanitarian access. Thank you for your attention.
I thank the distinguished representative of Belgium. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of South Africa.
Mr. President, thank you for convening this emergency special session to discuss Palestine's membership of the UN following the failure of Security Council to adopt a resolution on the matter. South Africa aligns with the statement delivered by the Republic of Uganda on behalf of the non-aligned movement. At the outset, South Africa reiterates its support for the full membership of Palestine to the United Nations. We believe that Palestine has met the criteria set out in Article 4 of the UN Charter and should therefore be admitted as a full member of the organization. Mr. President, next week, on the 15th of May, Palestinians will observe Nakba Day. This reminds us of the events 76 years ago when the world stood by and watched while hundreds of thousands of Palestinians were forced to flee or were expelled from their homes, villages, and towns. Very few have been able to return and reclaim their heritage and rights. It is regrettable that today, the historical events leading to the establishment of this august organization, which is meant to bring about global peace and security, runs almost concurrently with that of the period of occupation, which began with the Nakba. As we convene in this plenary hall, a war continues to be waged against Palestinians in the Gaza Strip, and a full-scale military operation announced by Israel is imminent in Rafah, despite caution by the international community of the catastrophic consequences of such an action. We are unfortunately witnessing once again the displacement of Palestinians from their very last refuge in Rafah. They have nowhere else to go. This wretched truth implies that we have again failed the people of Palestine. To date, no meaningful action has been taken to stop the genocidal actions in Gaza, nor have sustained efforts been taken to improve the flow of humanitarian relief and protect civilians. On 26 January 2024 and 28 March 2024, the International Court of Justice issued orders in relation to the right of the Palestinian people in the Gaza Strip to be protected from all acts within the scope of the Genocide Convention. The court ruled that South Africa's claim that the State of Israel, a state party to the Genocide Convention, has met the standard of plausibility and ordered inter alia, ordered Israel to take action to prevent and punish genocide, incitement to genocide, and to enable immediate and effective provision of basic services and humanitarian assistance to besieged Gaza. These provisional measures were issued by the court to prevent irreparable and irreversible harm to the rights of Palestinians, pending the court's final decision on the case. Regrettably, Israel has not complied with the court's binding order, but has instead escalated its genocidal acts against the Palestinian people. The time for a permanent ceasefire and a complete halt to offensives is long overdue. Mr. President, it is important to recognize that the application for membership of Palestine to the United Nations is occurring within a context of illegal occupation, which goes against the tenets of international law and the UN Charter. We should recall that despite the adoption of Security Council Resolution 2334, the expansion of settlements activities on illegally occupied land in the occupied West Bank, including East Jerusalem, has continued with impunity, which has a direct effect on prospects for attainment of the two-state solutions. The Secretary General noted earlier this year that a lasting end to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict can only come through a two-state solution. Any refusal to accept the two-state solution by any party must be firmly rejected, and that the denial of the right to statehood would indefinitely prolong the conflict. A one-state solution with huge Palestinian population inside that state without any real sense of freedom, rights, and dignity would be inconceivable. The only way to address the legitimate aspirations of both Israelis and Palestinians is through the two-state formula. We must remain steadfast in our commitment to supporting the just cause for justice and liberation of the people of Palestine. As member states who pledged their commitment to upholding the UN Charter, we have the ultimate responsibility to ensure and protect the inalienable rights of Palestinians. For how long must Palestinians wait for their turn to enjoy the rights that all of our people enjoy? For how long must Palestinians be subjected to discrimination and unjust policies that perpetuate a cycle of structural violence and violations of their human rights? Mr. President, at the very least, the international community needs to make incremental steps towards finding a peaceful political settlement for both Israel and Palestinians. Conferring full recognition to Palestine within the international legal order, conferring international legitimacy, leverage, and bargaining power inherent in recognized statehood would be the first step towards offering both sides a secure and better future. It is necessary to restore a balance that has in recent years tipped overwhelmingly in favor of Israel. No peace negotiations has much prospect of succeeding if the parties at the table are not engaging as equals. It is time for Palestinians to have the freedom to determine their own leadership without external interference and carve a path for their future. The situation in Palestine and Israel has caused untold human suffering and created serious difficulties for the stalled Middle East peace process. In order to move forward, we should acknowledge what the overwhelming number of us in this assembly already recognizes, that Palestine is indeed a state and should take its rightful place in this assembly. In conclusion, Mr. President, South Africa voted in favor of and co-sponsored the resolution on admission of new members to the United Nations. We believe that this will provide Palestine with an opportunity to play a meaningful role at the UN. We therefore join other member states in calling on the Security Council to reconsider its decision and consider this matter comprehensively. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of South Africa. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Senegal.
Monsieur le Président.
President, aligning ourselves with the statements made by Mauritania and Uganda on behalf of the Organization for Islamic Cooperation and the Non-Aligned Movement, respectively, Senegal would also like to say a few words in our national capacity. President, my delegation is grateful to you for having convened once again this 10th Emergency Special Session on the joint request of the Arab Group, the OIC, and the Non-Aligned Movement, in the aftermath of the failure of the Security Council to adopt a draft resolution recommending the admission of the State of Palestine as a full member of the United Nations. Senegal deplores, once again, that a veto prevented the admission of a State of Palestine. At a time when 12 out of the 15 members of the Council supported the draft recommendation, and that 144 of the 193 member states of the organization already recognize this state. This situation is even more regrettable given that the State of Palestine meets the criteria for a state and that its successive governments have continued to defend their rights that are enshrined by international law and relevant UN resolutions. They are party to numerous instruments under the aegis of the United Nations. They are full members of some UN bodies, and they are full members of several international organizations. They are peace-loving, and the State of Palestine continues to tirelessly show how they should be accepted within the concert of nations. There was no more eloquent example of this fact than their will expressed many times to become member of the United Nations. President, the number of states of the United Nations who recognize the sovereignty of the State of Palestine as a sovereign state is only growing. My delegation welcomes a recent decision of Barbados, Jamaica, Trinidad and Tobago and the Bahamas to recognize the State of Palestine, and we invite member states who have yet to do so to follow suit. The recognition of the State of Palestine should not be an obstacle to peace. Quite the contrary. Far from being an end in itself, it is today, 77 years after the partition plan of Palestine, it is a crucial stage to allow all parties concerned to work with equal responsibility and representation towards a just and sustainable solution to the conflict. Here, the State of Palestine cannot be left to the side. It would be wrong to continue to unjustly refuse them that which for so long and so justly has been given to the State of Israel, the status as a full member of the United Nations. Senegal has been loyal in how it is committed to this issue, and we continue to support tirelessly the admission of the State of Palestine as a full member of our organization. We are deeply convinced that the required majority would be easily obtained at the General Assembly. President, as we are unable to vote on the admission of the State of Palestine, which was unjustly denied by the Security Council, Senegal welcomes the adoption of this draft resolution, which we are proud to co-sponsor. This result, which came with a broad majority, sends a strong signal from the part of the international community. Through this resolution, the General Assembly is contributing to reaffirming dignity that has been owed for far too long to this state, allowing our organization to better benefit from the expertise of its representatives in our discussions. Also, it shows how we must urge the Security Council to reconsider as soon as possible the admission of this state. In the meantime, until this long-awaited day arrives, my country will continue to support all initiatives that seek to ensure the full and effective participation of the State of Palestine in the work of the General Assembly and in all other UN organs. President, the Palestinian people have the right to a viable state, a contiguous one with East Jerusalem as its capital and within safe and internationally recognized borders alongside the State of Israel. The fact that the State of Palestine still cannot be admitted as a full member of the United Nations reminds us how important it is to preserve and protect the inalienable rights of these people. The inalienable right to their land, which is continually flouted, including in the West Bank, because of aggressive occupation, settlement and annexation policies. The inalienable right to life, which is under threat day in, day out due to the humanitarian tragedy which continues to unfurl in Gaza. Also, my delegation deplores the Israeli offensive in Rafah, which has already led to more than 100,000 displaced people. It is certain that the human cost of this crisis is already unconscionable, with its 35,000 deaths and 78,000 people injured, will become even worse for the 2.3 million Gazans who are in constant mourning, deprived of any shelter in the north and in the south, plunged into the worst of distress. This is why Senegal, my delegation continues to urge Israel as the occupying power to demonstrate restraint and spare civilians, all humanitarian personnel, medical and media personnel, as well as hospitals, holy sites and UN facilities. Here, my country welcomes once again the unwavering commitment of the UN Secretary General and his commitment to a resolution of this crisis. My country reiterates its support to the teams of Mr. Philippe Lazzarini, Commissioner General of UNRWA, as well as all UN and non-governmental entities involved in this day-to-day work. My delegation hopes so strongly that a ceasefire and the release of hostages will happen rapidly with all of the necessary goodwill in place. Only a ceasefire will ensure safe, sustainable and unhindered humanitarian access. Only a ceasefire will allow for real de-escalation as a first step towards peace talks, seeking to achieve the two-state solution. That is the only solution worth having. We can see the path towards peace. This path includes the recognition, without further delay, of the State of Palestine, and recognize that they have all the rights and all legitimacy to sit alongside us on equal footing. Thank you very much indeed.
I thank the distinguished representative of Senegal. We have heard the last speaker in the debate on this item for this meeting. We shall hear the remaining speakers on Monday, May 13 at 10 a.m. in this hall. The meeting is adjourned.